Hi, and welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. My guest today is Ann Spencer. She's written a book about Joshua Slocum called Alone at Sea. Welcome.
Hi, Leslie.
Good to have you on the show.
Nice to be here.
This is a very interesting story about a man who sailed a ship around the world. The first man to sail a ship.
The first man, solo sail, yeah.
Way back when? 74,000 kilometers.
1895 he set sail, and it took him till late in 1898 when he came back in June, so just over 3.5 years.
Quite an incredible trip, and you know, what a guy to do that for the first time. And I want to talk about that whole voyage, but first, why would anybody want to do that?
Well, you know, when I started this book, that was the question. That's why when I started the book, I started with him just before he made the decision to go around the world. I didn't start right at the beginning as a child. I started the book when he was making the decision, because at age 48, Joshua Slocum had the age of sail. He was a master mariner. He had the age of sail die right out from under him. And
yes,
so
that was happening then.
The parallel to today's world really hit me over the head. I was thinking, you know, there's so many people that have just been ousted from their jobs because of computers and technology and changes. And he had the very same thing happen to him, and he was very stubborn. At age 48, he did not want to go steam.
So he was holding on to the old world.
He was holding on to the old world, and he was a purist. And so he refused to go steam, and he went to Boston, and he took odd jobs. He even worked as a stevedore. And you know, this man had sailed magnificent sailing ships, and he had been captain and part owner of them. And at 48, he just said, you know, here I am as a stevedore. I think a load of coal fell on his head, and he couldn't believe the difference in his situation in a few years, and he quit, and that was it. And so the whole story of how he was given a ship, and it was really a ship that was falling apart.
Yeah, I was going to say, this was not like top of the line kind of a sailing vessel or anything.
No, it was an old oyster sloop, and when Slocum was given it by Captain Eben Peirce, well, the story is that Slocum was down and out. He was walking along a Boston waterfront one day in the wintertime of 1892, and he met this old whaling captain. He said, you know, Captain Slocum, I've got a ship for you, but she wants some repairs. And that's how the old anecdote goes. And Slocum got quite excited. I think he thought he was going to get a ship. And he walked to Fairhaven the next day, and he went, and there on the end of a point, it was called Poverty Point, which Slocum's life is so full of symbolism. It's a wonderful name. And Slocum went up, and there on a cow pasture was an old oyster sloop, and it was just falling apart. And I think that even Peirce thought that Slocum would just tear it apart, and everyone came to sort of watch him remove this. And Slocum really loved challenges, and he decided that he was going to not tear it apart, but rebuild it. And he said he rebuilt it timber by timber, plank by plank. And the sense that I got when I was doing the research was that when he was rebuilding the boat, on a symbolic level, he was really rebuilding himself. And in many ways, his decision to me felt like a midlife crisis.
Yes.
And it was his response. And he was feisty and he was stubborn. I mean, every account of him was he was ornery, and you know, he just really had his way, and he decided to rebuild it, and that was that. And
yeah,
nothing
that's
was going to stop him.
That the stubbornness part is such an important quality that allowed him to do it. But take me back to 1844 and his origins in Nova Scotia.
Yes, well, he is a Nova Scotian, and that's really an exciting thing to remember. And a lot of people think of him as a Yankee, and he did call himself a naturalized Yankee, but in 1844, he was born to a farmer in Mount Hanley, which is just near Annapolis Royal. It's in the Annapolis Valley, and it overlooks the Bay of Fundy. And Slocum was one of 11 children, and his father was trying to make a living as a farmer there on the North Mountain, and I guess it wasn't very profitable. So at age 8, Slocum and his family moved to Briar Island. And I don't know if you've been to Briar Island.
Oh, it's a beautiful place.
Wonderful.
Very exotic, interesting neck of land.
Yes.
It's very separate from Nova Scotia in many ways.
Yeah, it's 2 ferry stops out in the Bay of Fundy.
Yeah.
And so there he grew up. And I don't know, when I started to write the book, I thought, you know, I really want to understand what a 10-year-old would feel growing up on this 4.5-mile island. I mean, that's how long it is, and it's not very wide. And it's just so rugged and full of cliffs and sort of trees that have just been blown around by the wind, and they're stunted their growth, and it's just the wild place. And I sat out on the end of a cliff called Greenhead Cliff, and I just shut my eyes, Leslie, and I thought, I'm just going to listen to the sounds, and I'm going to listen to the wind, and I'm going to listen to the waves lapping and the seabirds. and I'm just going to try to imagine what it's like to be 10 and to have a little boy sort of run along the cliff and then just stop because the land ends, and that's his home. And I opened my eyes and I looked out, and when I looked out, I swear it just felt like I was on the bow of a ship. And I thought I had my answer, that really he wasn't on a ship when he was 10, but he was on a boat that went hard aground. I mean, he wasn't going anywhere, but he may as well have been. He was looking right out to the water.
So when did he go off in his first long-distance ocean experience? Was he one of these Nova Scotia kids who, he was a teenager, he was just young, wasn't he?
Well, you know, he always loved the water, and he was always out and about in, you know, dories and small boats, but he had a very strict father, and his father really did not want Slocum to be out as a sailor, and I think he did everything to sort of break his sailor spirit. So he had Slocum work in a boot shop, and what I find really interesting is that there was Slocum at age 10, 11, 12 hammering square pegs into boot forms, and his life is just so symbolic that that's just a wonderful image for Slocum. And
long way from sailing a ship around the world.
But looking out, he had a window in the boot shop, and he would look out and he could see ships coming in, and they were just stopping at Briar Island, and then they were on their way to Africa, or they were going down south. And so he was always watching what was happening, and I think he was a dreamer.
And connected to that much larger world, not just across the Bay of Fundy or to Maine or something like that, but ships that, were going all the way around the world.
But there was quite a traumatic thing that happened when Slocum was just 12. He was really terrified of his father, and he was making a really intricate model of a ship, and he was so frightened his father would see him do it that he went down in the basement of the boot shop, and he, you know, would work away at his model, and his father found it, and he came in and he just smashed it to smithereens, and Slocum was really upset, and I think that was sort of where the door slammed shut on the relationship with his father. And Slocum ran away when he was 14, and he was, I think, trying to be a cook and trying to just have some freedom. I mean, that he rebelled, and then he was brought back, and I think he received quite a lashing. And at 16, after his mother died, Slocum did leave for the first time, and he left with a buddy from Briar Island, and they took off, and he just was eager to learn everything he could about navigation.
Of course, his father's mistrust of the sea was well-founded. A lot of people, a lot of Nova Scotians were drowning on these voyages. Now, when Slocum grows up and he's a captain of, it seems like quite a few ships. He's going from ship to ship, and this is all around the world. Why is that? Why didn't he just stick with one vessel?
Well, I think that's the way it was. And I mean, I think he was out to build a name for himself. He first went down into the States. Immediately, he wanted to sort of lose his ties with, you know, his roots back home, and he changed the spelling of his name from Slocum, C-O-M-B-E, to Slocum, C-U-M at the end. He moved, he called San Francisco his hailing port, and he spent a lot of time. He went over to Australia, and it was on one of those trips that he met his wife-to-be at age 27. He met Virginia Albertina Walker.
And she went sailing off with him as the captain's wife.
Yeah, and we think that it seems so courageous and so brave, but I think that there were a lot of women that chose to do that around that time. They just happened to be extremely well suited to each other, and it's quite a love story. And I mean, she sailed everywhere with him and raised a family for the next 14 years.
But there was a tragic ending. She died relatively young.
Yeah. She was not even 35. I think she was a month shy of her 35th birthday. And just outside of Buenos Aires, this woman who was, you know, by all accounts so cultured and just full of life, and educated all of her children aboard ship, and sang and danced and taught Sunday school and taught school right on the ship. She just got really sick after the, you know, birth of one of their children, and I think she had heart problems and died, and that was it for Slocum. He was just, well, his son said he was like a ship with a broken rudder. His life was never the same. And it's so hard to imagine, but this man who was a master mariner had this beautiful wife and 4 of his 7 children who had survived. 3 died in foreign ports. All of a sudden his life just started to unravel after Virginia's death, and it just unraveled at a really rapid speed.
It was really a dark phase for him.
It was.
He was still a fairly solitary man, despite having a family, I gather. I mean, you'd have to be a solitary person if you're eventually going to sail around the world by yourself.
And you know, I met Slocum's great-grandchildren when I went down to Boston. I went there when they were in June of 1998. They were just celebrating Slocum's 100th anniversary of coming back. And it was so wonderful to meet, Slocum and Virginia's great-grandchildren and hear accounts of the captain and his wife. And they all said that she was very intuitive and Slocum trusted that intuition. And she was a celestial navigator as well. So I think
Meaning that you look up at the stars and figure out where on the planet you are and how to get to the next place you want to go to.
And Slocum he sailed, he said, by intuition. And he was just, I think, someone who just understood the waves and the water and the planets. And, he was just a supreme sailor, yeah.
Now, what about this thing that happens in 1888? Joshua Slocum is off the coast of South America on the Aquidneck, and quite an adventure happens.
Well, in Brazil, he is now married to a woman named Hetty, who was only 24.
Much younger.
Yes. Yeah. And Hetty is a first cousin once removed, I believe, and she was from the Annapolis Valley, and he had met her in Boston. There they are. It's her honeymoon trip, and it's Slocum. He's on the Aquidneck, and it's a vessel that he owns, but he has it uninsured. And he's down there with his two sons, Victor and Garfield. And basically, they have a load of hay, and they're put in quarantine because there's an outbreak of cholera. And Slocum is really annoyed. He has to get this hay, into Rio de Janeiro, and he's not allowed to, come into port. And it's just sort of one misadventure after another. That timing, he felt, really affected everything. And in fact, he blamed the Brazilian government for the ultimate stranding of his vessel because he said had he not been quarantined, he wouldn't have met the tornado. And I mean, it was just ridiculous, how he blamed everyone for his misfortunes. But basically then, after the outbreak of cholera, they were detained again when his whole crew was infected with smallpox. And he lost just about everyone. There were only about 4 or 5 that, made it back from that. And then Slocum just was out one day and he stranded the vessel. And he lost everything. The vessel was uninsured, and there he was in Brazil.
A fairly remote part of Brazil, too,
yes, it was. Yeah. And so what he did was, I think he was very proud and again stubborn. See, stubborn keeps coming back, and he loved challenges, Leslie, and this is what we forget. And I really feel for Hetty because she was, a young woman.
This was his younger wife was with him, and he's going to improvise now.
He was going to improvise. He refused. The United States government could have brought Slocum back. I mean, and he could have declared bankruptcy and come back and started his life again. But he refused that kind of help. And what he did was, he said his second love next to sailing was shipbuilding. And he had, long ago studied how natives made canoes in British Columbia, and he was just really fascinated. And there in the jungle, this man hammered together something that they described as something like a Japanese sampan and a Cape Ann dory and
just
a bit
from
of
materials that are available and what he could scrounge from his.
And when he
old
needed
boat.
metal, sometimes he would take pennies and drill holes in them.
Yeah.
I mean, he was very inventive. And when I was writing this book, I would just laugh. You think about him and just how his stubbornness would just sort of, and this inventive mind that always wanted
there were
to,
no problems.
There
just
weren't
challenges
any. No.
there. Yeah, he sailed that north then to the United States.
55 days, and I mean this
with his wife and
with his wife
and
two sons.
2 sons. Yeah.
And I keep thinking it's Hetty's honeymoon trip, and she's sitting on a boat where she can't even stand up, and they come back into Washington, and he claims when he went to sail alone around the world that he had actually invited Hetty to come along, and she said, "No, Joshua, I've had a voyage," and I can only imagine that she had a voyage.
Quite a trip it was. Okay, we're going to take a short break right now. My guest is Ann Spencer. We're talking about the life of Joshua Slocum, and we'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Off the Page. My guest is Ann Spencer. We're talking about Joshua Slocum. We're coming up to this voyage around the world, but somewhere around 1892 here, he decides he's going to be a landlubber for a while?
Well, he was in Boston for a bit.
Yeah.
He actually became a landlubber just at the end of the voyage, and we can talk about that later. But he did, live in Boston for a little bit, and that's when he worked as he didn't like it.
He couldn't
and
possibly.
Leslie, this is another thing you asked why he sailed alone.
Mm-hmm.
When I was writing this book, I started to realize that every time this man lived on land, he just invited scandal. It's almost like he was a magnet for scandal. And
why? What did he do?
I think that he just really expressed himself, and he just
too opinionated.
Yeah, he was very opinionated, but he also just always had a knack of getting into trouble, and he was always embroiled in trouble. And just before he did, actually, when he was rebuilding the spray, he had one more stab at the Brazilian government. There's a really odd episode where he tows an iron gunboat called the Destroyer down to sort of be part of a civil war, and I think he thought he'd go down there and one more time try to get money from the Aquidneck.
Well.
So he was stubborn, and he just didn't know when to let go.
Yeah. Now at the top of the show, we started talking about the voyage, the historical one where he sails alone around the world, and how he put this vessel together. Definitely not top of the line. What's it like the day that he starts out from Massachusetts?
Oh, he just gives such a wonderful account about, what a thrill and the pulse beat and the, just sort of the thrill and the excitement and the crowd applauding for him. So I think that...
So people are there. They know what he's trying to do.
Yes, and they know. And actually, this man, he always wrote, and he kept journals. And he had arranged with publishers and newspapers that he was going to send his stories back home. But I think Slocum also... we tend to forget that on top of this adventurer, there's someone who just liked to sort of drift in and out of port and explore things at his own pace. So what does the man do? But he goes back to Briar Island. And
came home to Nova Scotia.
I think he got really nostalgic, and he stayed there, something like 35 days. And what happened was the interest in the newspaper syndicates, for this action story of a man who's going to sail, alone around the world, and he's going to report from every port. I mean, there he is, dilly-dallying in Nova Scotia and sort of just meeting old school chums. And
I'm picking up a few more things for his ship there.
Well, he goes to Europe.
Yeah.
This is so wonderful. He didn't want to pay the $15 to have his chronometer fixed.
No, of course not.
So
I don't blame him.
$1.50, and and then finally it's $1 because it has a crack. He buys a tin clock, and it just becomes this running gag on the voyage because the man is so in tune with the ocean anyway that he probably didn't even need the tin clock, and he claimed he used to have to boil it in water or in oil just to keep it going.
Oh, so. Yeah, who needs a watch if you're out there? Now then he heads across the Atlantic Ocean. Something happens along the way. He has a vision of Christopher Columbus.
Well, it's food poisoning, I guess, is what it was. He said he combined white cheese and plums. And
not supposed to do that at sea.
No.
Huh?
But you see, Slocum, there's this whole mystical element of Slocum, and the more you sort of investigated the man, I mean, people called him sort of a maritime Thoreau, because even though we think of the adventure of, being at sea and rogue waves and, all the wild things that Slocum had to face as a sailor, solitude was really a big one for him. But what had happened was when he ate these plums and the cheese, I guess he got food poisoning, was very, very sick, and he started to hallucinate. And he went down inside the cabin. He was so sick, and he had wretched pains, and he must have passed out. He looked up, and he claimed that he saw the pilot of Columbus's ship, the Pinta, and that he sailed him. This pilot, this ghost pilot, sailed him through until he woke up again. And I mean, I guess the vision was very real, and Slocum wrote about it. And in fact, that was one of the stories that he sent home to the newspapers to write about. So I think they published something like 3, and then that was it.
Well, that was a helpful thing to happen along the way. Was he a religious man?
I wouldn't say he was religious, but I'd say he was spiritual.
Yeah, connected to the sea.
Very connected
Something
to
that
the sea.
comes from the solitude.
And he said that, first it took him so long in the fog, almost immediately crossing the Atlantic Ocean. He had to, he said, penetrate a fog. He was in a fog for days, and he said then he knew that he was really alone. He could hear the water out there, but he knew that he had to sail through his loneliness. And once he sailed, I mean, it's like an outward bound experience. Once he sailed through that, then he sailed in a solitude supreme.
Was that the worst part of his trip, or did there were more dangerous things?
There were very dangerous things. And another thing that I had to remind myself of when I was writing the book was that he sailed at a time when there were pirates, and that there were still stories of cannibals. In the South China Sea, there were stories of cannibals. So he was actually, when he crossed the Atlantic the first time, he arrived in Gibraltar, and he intended to go through the Mediterranean. But immediately he was told that he should go right back across the Atlantic Ocean and go around, the Cape, the Horn.
That's what I thought was wrong with that map.
Yes.
He goes from Massachusetts, Nova Scotia, across to Europe, back to South America, and off the other way. It's like, he took a wrong turn at the beginning or something.
He did, and it's not like just going around the block. So he sails back across, and sort of the irony is that he's immediately chased by pirates. So the man... the whole trip for 3.5 years was adventure. I mean, really. And any time, one of the thoughts I had of Slocum was that, you know, this man, yes, it was adventure, but he claimed he could self-steer for days and days and days.
Yes.
So on top of the adventure, Leslie, he had life just, you know, I mean, I guess the paradox is that he was living out his freedom and his, you know, sort of happy, you know, cooking and reading in the cabin. He was living that all his freedom out on a 37-foot boat, you know.
But how does a person actually sail a ship alone like that over such great distances? He has to sleep, certainly.
He did. Well, I mean, he just would lash the wheel, and he would, he claimed this spray could self-steer. And I mean, people used to, I think after the voyage, really, they couldn't believe that he could do it. At one point, he said, you know, in 23 days, he was at the helm for 3 hours. So. And I've spoken to people who have had replicas of the spray and sailed them, and they said, yes, it's a forgiving, broad, beamy ship, and you know, you can do that and it'll stay right on course. So yes, that's what he said he did.
What happened when he came back home? Was he greeted with a hero's welcome back in Massachusetts?
No, not at all. No. And you see, I sometimes I felt sort of sorry for this man, because a lot of it, you know, he was doing these amazing deeds, and even his accounts of them, they're very self-effacing. He's not really, you know, telling you how dangerous it was. You can only imagine. And I interviewed a lot of sailors and asked them how incredible they thought these feats of seamanship were, and they were all just, you know, Slocum was their hero. But, you know, he went into foreign ports, and there'd be people on the wharves in Australia or whatever clapping him into port. And he gets back to the United States. It's the middle of a civil war, and he's sort of just, you know, coming into port, and people don't even know who he is.
Yeah, he's been gone a long while.
Yes, and he
just forgotten about.
And he hits the, I think, a tornado just off Fire Island. He was going to go into New York, and instead of going into New York, he ends up having to go back toward, you know, Rhode Island, and he doesn't get a hero's welcome. He arrives 1 o'clock in the morning. And then what does he do? He cleans up his ship the next day, and people have to row out to him.
Yeah. And I don't know, I'm just guessing if his life back on land was never as happy as it was at sea.
Oh, I don't
Once he tries to readjust, he couldn't.
You see, when he came back, then of course he wanted to write his stories, and he was a lecturer. I mean, this man was quite a storyteller, and for all his isolation and his need to be alone, I think when he was on land, and when he was on land in his own terms, that's what I think is really important here. Then, you know, he could be witty, he could be fun to be with, but I had the feeling that as soon as he didn't want to be there, I mean, it was almost like a temper tantrum. He'd sail away, and he'd have life on his own terms.
Right.
But, you know, he lived life best on the water, and that's just the simple fact of the matter.
Soared.
Yes,
That's
and
where he's most alive.
you know, he didn't have to compromise a whole lot of spirit, and
Right.
he was really
He didn't
lucky.
like
He had a
compromise.
young wife who looked after his children. I mean, that's basically it. And in many ways, his decision was a very selfish one. I mean, Hetty must have had a hard life, and she lived in Boston, and she worked as a gown fitter. And Slocum didn't have a lot of money, and he had a little bit when he wrote his book, and then he bought a house in Martha's Vineyard, and he tried to live on land. He tried to grow hops. And he just, I mean, there's a picture in this book of him holding a, you know, a hoe or something, and it looks like, you know, he's really not in touch with this land living at all.
Not him at all. We're going to take a short break, and we'll come back to tie up the story here with Joshua Slocum right after this. Off the page. We're talking about Joshua Slocum with my guest Ann Spencer. And he sails off into the sunset or the sunrise in the end, doesn't he?
He does. It's 1908, I believe, this happened, and he got into the habit of every fall going down south, collecting all sorts of curios, coming back in the spring and showing them off. 1908, he sets sail, and he never comes back again, Leslie.
Thanks very much for coming on the show and telling us about Joshua Slocum.
My pleasure.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. I'll see you again next time.